The study of self-defense is about so much more than just learning how to fight. In fact, I believe there are about 5 key areas that we need to be having conversations around on a regular basis. In this video, I want to share with you those things. Stick around. When it comes to the subject of self-defense, what we understand here is just as important as what we have here. And when I take a look at all of the conversations that should be had in this arena of thought, I've pretty much narrowed it down to 5 things. So let's get started. Number 1, we've got to always be talking about the things that help us avoid being in a physical altercation or an attack. Most people would call this conversation the situational awareness conversation, but I think it's about so much more than that. Those 2 words get thrown around a lot in the self-defense world. We also need awareness of our own pride and our ego. As I've talked about in other videos, awareness around where we go and when we go, or awareness with regards to the people that we're running around with. What it comes down to is there's a lot of things that we can talk about with regards to avoiding being in those types of situations. And that does need to be a part of your self-defense training. If all you're doing is learning how to fight, but you don't have this in play, you're ultimately missing the most important thing. The second area of focus is our physical training. Physical training is obviously a very important part of learning to defend yourself, but there's training that's good and there's training that's not so good, and it's learning how to recognize what is realistic and what is actually preparing us for the real world. The real world includes striking, wrestling, submissions, and weapons. If all the person ever learns is a striking art, they're not going to be fully prepared, because in the real world, there's a lot of wrestling, there's a lot of opportunities to submit and get submitted, and there's weapons involved. We've got to train in a well-rounded way. We've got to be prepared for all areas of the fight. A lot of times in the martial arts world, there's a lot of what I call cooperative partner training, where it's just not a real world simulation. And I think that our training really needs to be geared toward helping us to get familiar with what it feels like to clash with the unpredictable. So in summary, if you're training to defend yourself, it's good to get a base understanding of striking, wrestling, submissions, and the use of weapons. Now, that's a broad topic. I won't get into it yet. There's a lot of different weapons that we wield, but whatever you wield, you need to learn to use it efficiently. The third area of importance in the world of self-defense is the subject of everyday carry, or EDC. In my videos, I often call these equalizers. It's everything from firearms to knives to pepper spray, tasers, batons, knuckles. It's all of these things. But our everyday carry should not just consist of items that help us fight or help us equalize in a fight. It's also everyday items that we need for other things other than fighting to get through the day. Everyday carry is all about being prepared for all things, whether it's someone trying to attack you, a violent encounter, or just a day-to-day emergency. Sometimes defending ourselves is not about another person. Sometimes it's just, being prepared for when life happens. I've got a table laid out that I like to visit every morning that I keep a lot of things on there. I keep knives on that table. I keep various things, flashlights, knuckles, different things that I can choose from depending upon, where I'm going and what I'm doing. Sometimes my everyday carry might be lighter. Sometimes it might be heavier. But what you want to do is put together a place where you have things in one spot where you can go collect your thoughts and get what you need that day. Depending upon where you live, you might not be able to carry certain things that I can carry, vice versa. But in the end, we all need to be prepared to respond to attackers and emergencies. The fourth thing we need to be talking about on a regular basis in the study of self-defense is the reality of the fight, because we can't be but so prepared. Real fights, real attacks are very unpredictable. People come in all shapes and sizes and abilities. It's really good to just assume that everyone is dangerous, that everybody can fight. But when you get in a fight, you can spend your whole life preparing for that attack and for that fight. And there will always be the reality that you may not be successful. And we've got to keep those things in the back of our mind. If we will keep the reality of the fight and the reality that we may not be successful in the back of our mind, it helps us have a healthier perspective going into things, and it makes us a whole lot less likely to throw ourselves into a situation. There's a book titled Meditations on Violence. It's a really great book. It's a really sobering, eye-opening read, and it talks about how broad the subject of violence is and how all of us, in the grand scheme of things, have a very low level of experience with regards to violence as a whole. For example, if you're a professional fighter, you've done that your whole life, well, you have experience with that level of violence. If you have been in a few street fights and you've survived them, well, you have experience with that level of violence. But what we have to understand is that violence is much deeper and wider than any of us can understand. And there's different kinds of violence, and there's different types of situations. And we always have to have our eyes open to the fact that we don't know as much about violence as we think we do. I know what it's like to put on some gloves and go full contact with a competitor. I know what it's like to be in a street fight. I understand that level of violence, but I've never been in a real knife fight. I've never been in a real gunfight. So my point is that all of us may have had some experience with violence, but we have not experienced all that there is. Which leads us to number 5, a conversation we should have on a regular basis. We need to be talking about the implications of violence, the aftermath of it. Number 5 is a study in and of itself, because you have a lot of people out here carelessly throwing themselves into situations voluntarily, never thinking about the implications of violence, never thinking about the aftermath, never thinking about where it's going to lead. They just see the beginning of a situation. They don't see the ending. And understanding that there's a lot of implications to violence and there's a lot of aftermath that we can face causes us to be more due diligent in these other areas. I've made videos talking about different types of awareness, stuff about the implications of violence, and these areas that need to be studied in self-defense, and people will come in the comments and say, you didn't teach us anything. And what they were talking about was, I didn't teach them any martial art moves. I didn't teach them a specific fight strategy. Well, friends, there's more to self-defense than just learning how to fight, learning a new submission, learning a new strike. It's all of these things working together that makes a difference in our life. We need training, number 1, on how to avoid these things if all possible. Number 2, we need good physical training. Number 3, we need a good everyday carry system, and we need to be trained to be able to use those things. Number 4, we need to be talking about the reality of the fight and the attack, and how unpredictable it is, and how broad the spectrum of violence is, and how we may or may not be successful, because this will keep us focused on everything else, and it will keep us humble. Number 5, we need to study the implications of violence and the aftermath. We need to understand what all of that looks like, because a lot of people don't. They don't think about it. I believe these 5 things are things we need to study on a regular basis with regards to the subject of self-defense. I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Thanks so much for watching. Take care.